The terminal was quiet in that early morning way, where voices were low and footsteps echoed, and the only sound louder than a cough was the distant hum of announcements calling out cities in far-off countries. The flight to London was boarding now, gate 12 glowing softly with the usual mix of half-awake business travellers moving with practiced ease and tired tourists, clutching passports and coffees. One man stood a little apart from the crowd, tall, but slightly hunched in age, with silver hair and eyes that seemed both kind and far away at the same time. He wore an old-style suit that kind few men wore any more, the cloth neat, but clearly worn over many years, and in his hand was a single item, a folded newspaper so crisp it looked untouched. He did not walk with hesitation. He moved with the steady weight of time, with a cane made of dark polished wood that clicked gently against the jet bridge floor, each step quiet, but certain no one looked at him for long. Just another older gentleman, flying first class. They might have thought, except one person did look, and looked too long. The flight attendant near the front, young, sharp, composed with a name tag that read Priya, and a mind that worked faster than her words. She was trained. The man in seat 2 sat so still that for a moment the crew forgot he was even there, not because he faded into the background, but because he seemed to carry a silence around him, a space no one wanted to step into. It was not discomfort, it was not intimidation, it was something deeper, something most people could not name, but they felt it in the way their eyes shifted away from him too quickly, or lingered just a moment too long, as if trying to recall where they had seen him before. The flight had now been in the air for 27 minutes. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, the sound of service carts rolling quietly through the aisles, the clinking of cups and trays echoing softly through the luxury of first class. And still the man had not moved. He had not asked for tea or coffee. He had not taken off his jacket. He had not unfolded the small blanket tucked beside his seat. He simply sat with the same posture, the same quiet gaze, and the same sense of knowing that unsettled Priya more than she cared to admit. She approached with the tray like she always did, her steps, measured, her smile prepared. But when she reached to something in her hand trembled just slightly, the glass shifted on the tray, and she paused to steady it, her mind searching for the right words, or perhaps the right tone. But before she could speak, the man looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers with such clarity that it made her forget what she had intended to say. She remembered the moment clearly, years ago on another flight, when she had served a politician, a known one, loud and demanding, and proud of his name. She had treated him with formality, with attention, with care. But this man, this quiet old man, had received only suspicion from her, and now he was looking at her as if he had seen it happen, not just today, but 1,000 times before. "Would you care for anything?" she asked. Finally, tea, coffee, juice, her voice softer, now unsure for the first time in a long time. The man simply nodded once and replied, "If it is not too much trouble, tea would be lovely." And the way he said it, so calm, so precise, made her feel something strange, something like embarrassment, but deeper. She walked away quickly to fetch the tea, her thoughts loud in her head, louder than the engines and the conversations around her. She did not like the way she had handled it, and yet she could not explain why he had affected her so much. He had said almost nothing, had made no demand, no complaint, but there was something in his silence that made her question her judgment, and that was not something she had done in a very long time. Behind her, the man unfolded his newspaper slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and somewhere near the corner of page 3 was a small article, a case summary from the High Court, and the name listed at the top of the verdict was his own. The tea arrived on a small silver tray, the kind only first class, still offered with a porcelain cup and a small white napkin folded beside it. Everything about the service was quiet, polished routine. And yet when Priya returned to seat 2, her steps were slower, her hand steadier, her eyes more careful, as she set the tray down in front of him without speaking. The man nodded once, a gesture of thanks, as he lifted the cup with the kind of precision that came from years of practiced patience, and Priya stood for a moment longer than necessary, not out of pobedness, but because she could not shake the feeling that she had missed something important about him that had not been visible at first glance. She turned and walked away, but her thoughts did not go with her. They stayed behind, circling that seat, that name on the boarding pass, that face that felt like it belonged to another world, a higher place, and slowly the pieces started to rearrange in her mind. Farther down the cabin, in seat 3C, a middle-aged man with a large leather briefcase had noticed the exchange and leaned slightly into the aisle, watching the older gentleman with mild interest. He had seen that face before he was sure of it, not from television, not from film, but from something more serious, more respected, perhaps the newspaper, perhaps a televised verdict, or maybe a law magazine he had skimmed in an office waiting room. He reached into his bag, pulled out his tablet, and began to search something, quietly unsure of what he was even looking for, but drawn nonetheless by the sharp memory that whispered, "You know this man, you have seen his eyes before." Meanwhile, Priya stood in the galley, staring at the wall, trying to quiet the voice in her head, the one that kept asking if she had treated that man fairly, if she had judged too quickly. And now the memory of his voice played back slowly, each word perfectly measured, not like someone used to being served, but like someone used to being listened to and understood. She turned to her fellow attendant, a man named Arjun, who was busy arranging cutlery, and asked casually, "Have you seen the gentleman in 2A before? Something about him feels familiar." Arjun shrugged. "Maybe he's a retired professor or a diplomat. They come through here all the time." But Priya shook her head. "It's more than that. It's the way he carries himself. It's the way he looks at you, like he's already seen your answer before you give it." Back in seat 2, the man had finished his tea, folded the napkin, set everything back exactly where it was, and returned to his newspaper. But his eyes were not reading now. They were thinking, not worried, not tired, just waiting. He could feel it too, the quiet shift in energy, the subtle way the air changed, when someone begins to be remembered, not as a stranger, but as someone important, as someone who once held a gavel that carried the weight of a nation. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin had settled into that quiet rhythm that only long-haul journeys know, the sound of pages, turning screens, flickering cups clinking against saucers. And yet there was an undercurrent running beneath it, all attention so soft it could be missed by anyone not paying attention. But for those who noticed it, the shift was unmistakable. In seat 3C, the man with the briefcase had not stopped searching. His screen now showed a list of names, titles, articles, headlines about court rulings and legal cases. And with each news scroll, his expression changed from curiosity to certainty. He looked again at the man in 2, who was now staring out the window with a stillness that no one else in the cabin could match. Priya passed through the aisle again, tray in hand, but her eyes drifted to 2. Not just in passing now, but with something more careful, something bordering on respect, though she would not admit it to herself. Not yet. She could feel something had shifted in her view of him. It was not about who he was anymore, but how she had responded to him earlier, and how she could not forget the weight of his silence. 2 rows behind them, a soft conversation began between a husband and wife, older, quiet, their voices low, but their glances unmistakable. They too had recognized something, and though they could not place his name, they knew that the man in 2A was not just a passenger. He was someone they had seen before, someone who had spoken calmly on television, wearing robes of authority, not fame, and who had made decisions that shaped lives far beyond their own. Arjun returned to the galley where Priya was standing, her back to the coffee machine, her eyes unfocused, and he said softly, "I think you were right. He looks like someone from the court, not a politician, not a celebrity, something more serious. I think he might be retired, but not forgotten." Priya nodded slowly, her thoughts returning to his eyes the way they had looked through her, not in judgment, but in quiet knowing, and for a moment she felt something unfamiliar, a sense of regret, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had failed to see someone for who they really were. Back in his seat, the man did not move, but he was aware he could feel the change around him, the quiet recognition, the shifting glances, the subtle murmur of memory, and he remained calm, his face unreadable, his hands resting gently on his cane, like they had on so many long days in the courtroom. He was used to being unseen until he was needed, and he knew well how truth often arrived too late for comfort, but right on time for reflection. The whispers were growing softer but more frequent now. The man in seat 2A was no longer just a figure from a passing glance. He had become a puzzle, a mystery they could not solve. And though no one spoke of it aloud, everyone felt it, the shift in the air, the growing recognition that something had been missed, something important, something just beyond reach. Priya moved through the aisle again, but this time her eyes kept drifting toward 2, and more often than before she caught herself, once looking too long and quickly turned away, but she could feel the weight of his gaze following her, almost as if he knew what she was thinking before she had the chance to understand it herself. Back in seat 3C, the man with the briefcase had found what he was searching for. He sat back in his seat, staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open as the image of the elderly man in 2A appeared in a news article from years ago. It was an old photo, but unmistakable. The man was younger, then his face full of authority, but still the same deep eyes, the same calm presence. The headline read, "High Court Judge Retires After Decades of Service." The man's breath caught for a second as he read the article again. Then he looked at Priya, who was still walking down the aisle, still unaware, and for a moment he considered saying something, but then he thought better of it. His mind raced with what he should do, what he could do, and yet he said nothing. He sat quietly, his gaze never leaving Tua, his fingers tapping anxiously on the armrest. Priya entered the gallery again, and this time Arjun was standing there waiting for her. He glanced over his shoulder toward the man in seat 2A and said, "Did you see it? Did you read it about the judge?" She blinked at him, confused, and Arjun nodded slowly. "I think it's him. I think he's the one from the papers. He retired from the court years ago. But everyone knows him. Still, everyone remembers his rulings. They shaped so much." Priya felt her heart skip a beat. She turned quickly to look at the man in 2A, but she could not read him, not yet, and she was too afraid to approach him again. The feeling of having missed something important still gnawed at her, like an unanswered question she was afraid to ask. Meanwhile, the man in seat 2A was still watching the clouds outside his window, his face as unreadable as ever, but in his mind the thoughts were moving like the flight path beneath them. He knew what would come next. He had been here before, had seen this moment unfold many times, when recognition comes too late, when the truth is realized, but only after it's too far gone to change anything. He sighed softly, but did not move. The tension in the air had thickened, and now it was undeniable. The quiet man in seat 2 had not just captured their attention, he had become the center of it. His stillness, his unspoken presence, had turned him into something more than just a passenger. He was the unknown, the unsolved mystery. And as much as Priya tried to focus on the rest of the cabin, she could feel it pulling at her, the question she couldn't answer. She passed him once more, her heart beat quickening without reason, and for the first time since boarding she felt herself truly looking at him, no longer as a vague face, but as someone she needed to understand, someone who held answers, even if she didn't know the questions yet. The man in 2A continued to sit still, his posture unchanging, and his eyes were once again turned toward the window, but there was a slight shift in his gaze this time, as if he had sensed the growing unease around him. And though no one could hear it, the silence around him became louder, it became heavier in the cabin, and the whispers between passengers had grown into more than curiosity. It was recognition mixed with uncertainty. Arjun caught sight of Priya again, and his voice was low. When he spoke, "You know, he's not just anyone, right? He's the judge, the one everyone spoke about when he retired. No one thought he'd actually leave the bench. But he did, and when he did, the cases he presided over went on to shape everything even today. And Priya stopped mid-step, her eyes widening at his words, but her voice caught in her throat. She hadn't thought it was possible. She hadn't even dared to consider it. But now it clicked, the way the man held himself, the way he observed the world with careful attention. She turned back toward Tua, her breath shallow. She could see it now, the unmistakable calm, the weight of authority that had always been there, and yet she had dismissed it. She had dismissed him without a second thought. Meanwhile, in 3C, the man with the briefcase was once again staring at the screen, but his expression had changed. His fingers hovered over the tablet, but now they were still unsure, as if he were suddenly questioning whether or not to approach the truth, or leave it buried deep in the shadow of his own doubt. What would he say to the man, if he was indeed who he thought he was? What could he possibly say to a former High Court judge, who had been responsible for so many decisions, shaping lives, altering futures? What could anyone say? Priya stood frozen, now unsure what to do. The weight of what she had just realized began to sink in deeper than anything she had ever felt before. What had she missed? What had she done wrong? And yet her eyes turned toward the man again, and something in her told her she was wrong for feeling sorry for him, wrong for feeling sympathy for what she had assumed was a frail old man, because in truth this was no frail old man at all. This was someone who had carried the world on his shoulders, and though his years might have passed, the weight of what he had done was still alive inside him. He had known all along. The air had grown thick in the cabin now, and Priya could feel it all around her, a subtle tension that she had tried to ignore. But now it was impossible to deny. The whispers had grown more frequent, the glances more obvious, and she couldn't help but feel them all pointed at her, the crew, the passengers, the quiet realization that something was terribly off. She glanced down at the tray in her hands again, suddenly unsure of what to do. Should she serve the man again? Should she speak to him again? Or should she let it go? But there was no escaping the nagging feeling that something had been left unsaid, something important had been missed. The truth she had dismissed as irrelevant earlier now loomed larger and more undeniable. She turned toward Arjun in the galley, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think he knows they're looking at him? Do you think he realizes how much they're staring at him? Arjun didn't respond immediately, but she saw him glance back toward 2A, where the elderly man sat as composed as ever, his hands folded over his cane, his gaze steady, as if the entire atmosphere in the cabin didn't touch him at all, as if he was above it all. And for the first time Priya felt herself shiver. There was something almost unnerving about the way he seemed to carry himself, like a man who knew too much or had seen too much. Arjun finally spoke, his voice low. He must know. He's been around long enough to know when people start staring like that, when they start to whisper. And he's not fazed at all. But why would he be? Priya, it's not the first time. He's probably seen this before. Hasn't he lived his whole life like this? Priya nodded slowly, but inside she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure why, but she felt unsettled by how calm he was, as though he expected to be recognized, as though this moment was inevitable. And now she found herself caught between an instinct to apologize and a growing fear that she had crossed a line she couldn't take back. The man in 2A remained unmoving, his silence absolute, and it was only the slightest shift in his posture that hinted he was aware of what was unfolding around him. But he didn't react, he didn't even look up. When the whispers reached their peak, when the man in seat 3C finally stood up and walked down the aisle, his eyes locked onto Priya for just a moment before turning toward the galley with a quick, decisive step. Priya watched him go, confused, but before she could ask Arjun anything more, a voice interrupted her, soft and respectful, a voice she hadn't expected. It came from the elderly man in 2A as he turned toward her for the first time since she had served him tea. Priya, I believe you have made a mistake, he said, his voice quiet but commanding, and Priya felt the words as if they carried weight heavier than any gavel. She stared at him, taken aback, unsure of how to respond or even what to say. And in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The moment had come when no one could pretend anymore. No one could act like this was just a coincidence or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was more than that. It was something deeper, something almost destined, something that had been waiting for this moment to unfold like a quiet storm about to break. Priya stood frozen in the aisle, her gaze locked onto the man in seat 2A. And for the first time since boarding, she saw him as he truly was, not the frail elderly passenger, not the man who seemed to have slipped under her radar, but the high court judge who had shaped the laws of this land, the man who had stood at the center of power and justice for decades. And now here he was on this plane, as calm as ever, as quiet as ever, and yet surrounded by the growing weight of the truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked down at the tray she was holding, and she wondered how long it had taken for the man in 2A to notice the change in the air. How long had he known that the quiet whispers and the shifting glances were a recognition of his past, the weight of his legacy, the unspoken acknowledgement that he was no ordinary man? Arjun watched her from the galley, his expression unreadable, but his eyes full of questions. He too had put the pieces together, and though he had tried to remain calm, tried to pretend that everything was as it should be, he now felt the enormity of the situation settle around him, and he knew there was no easy way out of this, no quick fix to make it right. But the man in seat 2 remained unruffled, unbothered by the attention. He was receiving, unbothered by the slow realization that had begun to spread across the cabin. He simply sat there, as though he had expected this moment to come. He had known all along that his presence would eventually be noticed, that his quiet authority would eventually demand recognition, but he did not rush to it. He did not seek it out. He only waited. In seat 3C, the man with the briefcase had finally made his decision. His fingers hovered over the tablet one last time before he stood up slowly and walked toward the galley, his steps deliberate, his eyes never leaving the man in 2A. Priya saw him coming, and something in her stomach twisted. She was not sure why, but she felt she should stop him, that she should apologize for what had been done. But the man in 2A had already risen from his seat, and she could see the shift in his posture, the way he moved now, not like a frail elderly man, but with the assuredness of someone who had commanded a courtroom, someone who had spoken with authority and power. He was no longer just a passenger, no longer just an old man trying to make his way through the flight. He was a figure of respect, a figure of consequence. And in that moment, as the entire cabin fell into an uneasy silence, it became clear to everyone that this flight had become more than just a journey from one place to another. It had become a reckoning. Priya stood there watching him as he made his way to the front of the cabin, and something inside her shifted. She understood now the truth was never in the service tray, or the words spoken. It had always been in the way you see the world, the way you carry the weight of what you've done in silence without need for acknowledgement or applause. And as the plane continued its path through the sky, the quiet man who had once ruled a courtroom walked down the aisle, a man not forgotten, but simply waiting for others to remember.